Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath the pages of our history books? What if I told you that the greatest cover-up in human history wasn't a single event, but an entire millennium erased, manipulated, and rewritten by those who held the keys to knowledge itself? Tonight, as the world settles into darkness, let's drift together through the shadows of time, where truth and deception dance in an eternal waltz. Close your eyes and imagine 1,000 years vanishing like smoke, leaving behind only whispers of what once was, and the haunting question, what really happened during the so-called Dark Ages? You've been told this story since childhood. Rome falls, barbarians sweep across Europe, and humanity stumbles into a dark pit of ignorance and superstition. For nearly a millennium, they say, progress stopped, science died, art withered, knowledge itself seemed to vanish from the face of the earth. But what if this story, taught in every classroom, depicted in every movie, accepted without question by generations of scholars, is itself the greatest lie ever told? What if the Dark Ages weren't dark at all, but were deliberately painted black to hide something far more extraordinary? Picture this: an empire of knowledge, stretching across continents, controlled by a single institution, an organization so powerful that it could not only shape what people believed, but control what they remembered. An entity that understood that true power doesn't come from armies or gold, but from the ability to write history itself. This institution still stands today, its ancient walls hiding secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know about human civilization. Its archives stretch for miles underground, containing documents that have never seen the light of day. Its influence reaches into every corner of the modern world, yet its deepest secrets remain locked away, protected by layers of tradition, ritual, and absolute silence. Tonight, we're going to explore the possibility that what we call the Dark Ages represents not humanity's fall into ignorance, but the most sophisticated cover-up in recorded history. A deception so complete, so masterfully executed, that even today, 15 centuries later, we still live within its carefully constructed lie. As you settle deeper into comfort, let the familiar world of textbook history drift away, because what we're about to discover together may change forever how you see the past, the present, and the very nature of truth itself. The greatest cover-up in history isn't hidden in some distant vault. It's hiding in plain sight in every history book, every documentary, every story we've been told about who we are and where we came from. Are you ready to step through the looking glass of official history to discover what lies beyond the carefully maintained facade of the Dark Ages? Then take my hand and let's descend together into the deepest mystery humanity has ever concealed from itself.
What makes a cover-up the greatest in history? Is it the number of people deceived? The length of time the lie persists? Or perhaps it's something far more profound, the complete reshaping of human consciousness itself. Throughout history, we've witnessed remarkable deceptions. Governments have hidden military secrets. Corporations have buried dangerous research. And powerful individuals have erased their crimes from public record. But these pale in comparison to what we're examining tonight. We're talking about the systematic manipulation of an entire millennium of human experience. Consider the characteristics that would make any deception truly monumental. First, it would need to be comprehensive, not just hiding a single event, but rewriting the entire narrative of human progress. Second, it would require absolute control over information. Every book, every document, every voice that could contradict the official story. Third, it would need to persist across generations, becoming so deeply embedded in collective memory that questioning it would seem not just wrong, but insane. The period we call the Dark Ages checks every one of these boxes with chilling precision. Think about it this way. We're told that for nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1400 CE, an entire continent, the very cradle of Western civilization, simply stopped progressing. No major inventions, no scientific breakthroughs, no architectural marvels, no philosophical advances. For comparison, in that same period, China invented printing, paper money, and gunpowder. The Islamic world preserved and expanded upon Greek knowledge, made revolutionary advances in medicine and mathematics, and created some of history's most sophisticated societies. But Europe? Europe supposedly sat in darkness, waiting for divine intervention. This narrative requires us to believe that the descendants of Rome, inheritors of Greek philosophy and engineering, simply forgot how to think. That the same bloodlines that produced Caesar and Cicero, Archimedes and Aristotle, suddenly lost the capacity for innovation and discovery.
Does this sound plausible to you? Or does it sound like exactly the kind of story someone might tell if they wanted to hide what really happened during those centuries? The genius of this particular deception lies not in what was hidden, but in what was substituted. Instead of erasure, we have replacement. Instead of empty centuries, we have a carefully crafted narrative of ignorance and superstition. Instead of missing history, we have a story so compelling, so emotionally satisfying, that generations of scholars have devoted their lives to studying it, without ever questioning its fundamental premise. This is the hallmark of the perfect cover-up. It doesn't deny that something happened. It simply changes what that something was. And at the center of this millennium-spanning deception sits an institution that possessed three crucial assets: the infrastructure to collect and control all written knowledge, the authority to determine what could be taught and learned, and most importantly, the luxury of time. Centuries upon centuries to craft their narrative so perfectly that it would become indistinguishable from truth itself. But who had such power in medieval Europe? Who possessed the resources, the motivation, and the absolute authority necessary to orchestrate such a vast rewriting of history? The answer lies not in some shadowy conspiracy, but in an institution that operated in broad daylight, whose power was not secret but celebrated, whose control over knowledge was not hidden but proclaimed as divine mandate. An institution that still exists today, still guards its secrets, and still shapes how billions of people understand their past. Imagine walking through the greatest library the world has never known. Thousands upon thousands of scrolls line the walls. the accumulated wisdom of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Persia, mathematical treatises that could revolutionize engineering, medical text that could save countless lives, philosophical works that could transform how humanity sees itself, scientific observations that could accelerate progress by centuries. Now imagine watching as, one by one, those scrolls disappear, not destroyed in some dramatic conflagration, but quietly, systematically removed by men in robes who claim they're preserving them for safekeeping. The shelves grow emptier each day, yet no one protests because these men speak with the authority of God Himself. This isn't fantasy. This is exactly what happened across Europe in the centuries following Rome's fall. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it left behind the most sophisticated knowledge network the world had ever seen. Public libraries in every major city, schools that taught mathematics, rhetoric, philosophy, and natural science. An educated class of administrators, teachers, and researchers who maintained the intellectual infrastructure of civilization itself. Within 2 centuries, almost all of it was gone. The official story tells us this knowledge was simply lost in the chaos of barbarian invasions. Libraries burned, scholars fled, the delicate machinery of learning collapsed under the weight of endless warfare and social upheaval. It's a tidy explanation, and for centuries no one questioned it. But when we look more closely at the evidence, a different picture emerges, one far more disturbing than simple loss or destruction. Consider the curious fate of ancient texts during this period. We know from various sources that thousands of Greek and Roman manuscripts survived well into the 6th and 7th centuries. Yet by the 9th century, the vast majority had vanished, not just from public access, but from all record entirely. Where did they go? The answer lies in a network of institutions that emerged from the chaos of Rome's fall with remarkable organization and purpose: the Christian monasteries. These weren't just religious retreats, they were sophisticated operations for collecting, copying, and most importantly, controlling written knowledge. Monasteries sent out scribes and scholars across the known world with a specific mission: locate and preserve any surviving texts from the ancient world. They arrived with promises of protection, offers of compensation, and the unquestionable authority of the Church behind them. Local leaders, desperate for stability in uncertain times, handed over their precious libraries willingly. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. These manuscripts weren't simply copied and returned. They were translated into ecclesiastical Latin, a specialized form of the language that only trained church scholars could read. Original texts were deemed corrupted or dangerous and quietly disappeared into church archives. Even more telling is what happened to texts that contradicted Christian doctrine. Works on natural philosophy that explained natural phenomena without invoking divine intervention. Medical treatises that described the human body in purely physical terms. Historical accounts that portrayed pre-Christian societies as sophisticated and enlightened. These weren't just hidden, they were systematically rewritten. Ancient Roman histories were edited to emphasize chaos and moral decay. Greek philosophical works were modified to support Christian theology. Scientific texts were either altered to include supernatural explanations or simply left uncopied, condemned to rot in forgotten corners of monastery cellars. The Church called this process preservation.
But what they were really doing was creating a filter through which all human knowledge had to pass. Any idea that didn't support their worldview was trapped in the filter. Any concept that might inspire people to trust their own reason over church authority was removed from circulation. But knowledge leaves traces, and some of those traces are troubling. Hidden in monastery archives across Europe, independent researchers have uncovered fragments of texts that shouldn't exist according to the official timeline. Astronomical calculations of stunning accuracy, dated to the 7th century. Engineering diagrams for machines that supposedly weren't invented until the Renaissance. Medical procedures that weren't rediscovered until the 19th century.
These fragments suggest that during the supposed Dark Ages, learning didn't stop. It was simply driven underground, hidden from view, and eventually erased from official memory. Even more mysterious are the artifacts that keep turning up in archaeological digs across Europe. Mechanical gears of extraordinary precision found in sites dated to the 8th century. Optical lenses ground to specifications that required mathematical knowledge supposedly lost until much later. Architectural techniques that created structures still standing today, yet no one remembers how they were built. When archaeologists find these anomalies, they're often dismissed as outliers or misclassified. Dating methods are questioned. Alternative explanations are suggested. But the artifacts themselves remain silent witnesses to a level of sophistication that doesn't fit the narrative we've been taught. Perhaps most telling of all is what happened to the people who created this knowledge, the scholars, inventors, and thinkers who must have existed during these centuries. Their names have been almost entirely erased from history. Instead of human genius, we're given stories of miracles. Instead of brilliant individuals, we're told about divine intervention. It's as if an entire class of people, the intellectuals and innovators who drive human progress, simply vanished from the historical record. Not because they stopped existing, but because their existence didn't serve the story that those in power wanted to tell. And so the greatest library in human history was transformed into something else entirely, a vast collection of approved thoughts, sanctioned knowledge, and carefully edited truth. The rest, the dangerous ideas, the revolutionary concepts, the knowledge that might inspire people to think for themselves, was locked away in vaults so deep and dark that even today, most of the world has forgotten it ever existed. Time is supposed to be absolute, unchangeable, a river that flows in one direction, carrying events from past to present to future in an unbroken stream. But what if I told you that this river has been dammed, diverted, and artificially lengthened by human hands? What if the very calendar we use to measure our existence is itself a lie? In the late 20th century, a German historian named Herbert Illig proposed something so shocking that it sent tremors through the academic world. He suggested that approximately 297 years of European history, from 614 to 911 CE, never actually happened. That these centuries were invented, inserted into our timeline by a conspiracy of powerful figures who needed to adjust history for their own purposes. At first glance, this seems impossible. How could nearly 3 centuries simply be fabricated? But as you sink deeper into the evidence, the possibility becomes not just plausible, but frighteningly likely. Consider this.
When modern astronomers use computer models to trace the paths of celestial bodies backward through time, they can predict exactly when and where solar eclipses, comets, and other astronomical events should have occurred throughout history. These calculations are precise to the minute because the movements of heavenly bodies follow unchanging mathematical laws. Yet when researchers compared these astronomical predictions with medieval European records of eclipses and celestial events, they found something deeply disturbing. Dozens of eclipses that should have been recorded during the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries simply aren't mentioned in any surviving documents. Conversely, many eclipses that European chroniclers claim to have witnessed took place under clear skies, according to astronomical calculations. The stars don't lie. They can't be bribed, threatened, or convinced to support a false narrative. They follow their ancient paths with mechanical precision, indifferent to human politics or religious doctrine. And their testimony suggests that the official timeline of European history is wrong. But astronomical evidence is just the beginning. The deeper you dig into the records of these supposedly missing centuries, the stranger things become. Take Charlemagne, the great Holy Roman Emperor who supposedly ruled in the early 9th century. According to official history, he was a towering figure who united much of Europe, sparked a renaissance of learning, and created an empire that lasted for centuries. Yet, when you examine the details of his life and reign, unsettling parallels emerge. Charlemagne's military campaigns mirror those of Constantine the Great from the 4th century with almost suspicious precision. His administrative reforms echo Constantine's policies point by point. Even his court procedures and ceremonial protocols seem to be direct copies of Constantine's innovations. The similarities are so extensive that some historians have suggested Charlemagne was simply Constantine, with a different name and a manufactured backstory placed 500 years later in history. This pattern repeats throughout the supposed Dark Ages. Historical figures appear to be copies, variations, or composite characters based on earlier personalities. Dynasties seem to repeat their predecessors' actions with uncanny accuracy. Even major events, wars, coronations, religious controversies, echo earlier occurrences so closely that they read like historical photocopies rather than original events. Why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to fabricate centuries of history? The answer becomes clear when you consider who benefited from adjusting the timeline. In the year 1000 CE, according to Christian doctrine, Christ was supposed to return to earth. This wasn't a vague prophecy. It was a specific promise that had shaped Christian thought for centuries. As the year 1000 approached on the official calendar, religious authorities faced a crisis. What would happen when Christ failed to appear as promised? But there was a solution. If the calendar was wrong, if the actual year was only 700 or 800 rather than 1000, then the second coming could be postponed indefinitely. All that was needed was to insert a few extra centuries into the historical record, creating buffer time between the supposed present and the prophesied end times. This theory gains credibility when you examine the key figures who would have had both the motive and the means to orchestrate such a massive deception. Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor around the year 1000, worked closely with Gerbert of Aurillac, a brilliant scholar who later became Pope Sylvester II. Both men had access to the archives and resources necessary to rewrite history on a continental scale. More importantly,
Both lived during a period when the Church had virtually absolute control over written records, education, and the calendar system itself. If anyone could insert phantom centuries into the timeline, it would be these men working in coordination with the vast network of monasteries and scriptoriums that controlled medieval knowledge. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for timeline manipulation comes from the calendar reforms themselves. The Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar, had accumulated an error of several days by the medieval period. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar in 1582, he supposedly corrected this drift by removing 10 days from that year. However, independent calculations suggest that if the Julian calendar had really been in use for the full period claimed by official history, the accumulated error should have been much larger, closer to 13 or 14 days. The fact that only 10 days needed correction suggests that the Julian calendar hadn't been in use for as long as the official timeline claimed.
In other words, the calendar evidence supports the idea that several centuries of history never actually occurred. Think about the implications. If 297 years were artificially inserted into our timeline, then we're not living in 2025, we're living in approximately 1728. The entire framework we use to understand our place in history is based on a fundamental error, or more accurately, a deliberate deception. This would mean that events we think happened over a millennium ago actually occurred just centuries past. It would mean that the Renaissance happened much closer to ancient Rome than we've been taught. It would mean that the Dark Ages, this supposed pit of ignorance and stagnation, were largely fabricated to create artificial distance between the ancient world and the medieval revival. But why stop at 297 years? If powerful institutions could insert 3 centuries into the timeline, what else might they have modified? How much of our understanding of chronology, cause and effect, and historical development is built on manipulated foundations? The control of time isn't just about adjusting dates, it's about controlling humanity's sense of progress, development, and possibility. When you control time, you control hope itself. And hope, more than armies or gold, is the ultimate source of human power.
Deep beneath the streets of Rome, in chambers where sunlight has never touched stone, lies the most secretive library in human history. Its official name is the Vatican Secret Archives, though the Church now prefers the softer term Vatican Apostolic Archives. But words cannot disguise what this place truly represents: the largest collection of hidden knowledge on earth. Picture, if you will, walking through corridors that stretch for miles underground. The air is thick with the scent of ancient parchment and leather bindings. Your footsteps echo in chambers lined floor to ceiling with documents spanning nearly 2 millennia. 53 linear miles of shelving, over 12 million documents. Secrets that could rewrite human history, locked away in climate-controlled darkness. This is not speculation. This is not conspiracy theory. The Vatican's secret archives are real, documented, and acknowledged by the Church itself. What remains hidden is what they contain. The Vatican claims these archives hold administrative records, diplomatic correspondence, and routine church business. But consider this. If these documents are truly mundane, why has access been so restricted for centuries? Why are researchers limited to examining just 3 documents per day? Why are photography and digital copying strictly forbidden? Why do some sections remain completely sealed, accessible only to the Pope and his most trusted advisors? The answer becomes clearer when you understand how this vast collection was assembled. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church operated the most sophisticated intelligence network in human history. While kings and emperors fought over territories, the Church quietly built something far more valuable, an empire of information. The foot soldiers of this empire were the monastic orders, Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, and later the Jesuits. These weren't simply men seeking spiritual enlightenment. They were highly educated, multilingual scholars with a very specific mission: locate, acquire, and secure every significant manuscript, document, and text in the known world. These monks traveled to every corner of Europe and beyond, carrying the authority of the Church and the promise of protection in chaotic times. Local rulers, desperate for stability, gladly handed over their libraries and archives to church representatives. Ancient texts from Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic cultures were preserved by being transported to monastery scriptoriums, where they were copied, translated, and edited. But preservation was never the true goal. Control was. Any text that contradicted church doctrine was marked as heretical. Any knowledge that might inspire people to trust their own reason over religious authority was deemed dangerous. Any document that suggested alternative explanations for natural phenomena was classified as blasphemous.
These forbidden texts weren't destroyed. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they were locked away in special archives, accessible only to church authorities who needed to understand potential threats to their power. Over centuries, this process created the most comprehensive collection of suppressed knowledge in human history. The scope of this collection becomes evident when you examine what little has been revealed. In 1981, the Vatican opened a tiny fraction of its archives to researchers, documents related to Pope Pius XI's papacy. Even this limited release yielded shocking discoveries: evidence of secret negotiations with fascist governments, hidden financial arrangements, and private correspondence that contradicted the Church's public positions. If such revelations emerged from examining just one pope's relatively recent papers, imagine what secrets lie buried in the deeper, older sections of the archives. Consider the lost Gospels, texts that present radically different versions of Christianity's foundational stories. The Gospel of Thomas, which portrays Jesus as a wisdom teacher rather than a divine savior. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which suggests she was Jesus' closest disciple and successor. The Gospel of Philip, which describes Jesus as married and having children. For centuries, the Church claimed these texts were either lost or had never existed. Then, in 1945, a collection of such Gospels was discovered buried in clay jars near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. Suddenly, scholars could read documents that church authorities had insisted were mythical. But here's the crucial question. If copies of these texts survived in Egyptian desert caves, What other versions might be preserved in the climate-controlled perfection of Vatican vaults? How many alternative gospels, philosophical treatises, and historical accounts are still locked away, waiting for the day when their secrets might safely emerge? The Church's own records hint at the scope of suppressed knowledge. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, existed from 1559 to 1966 and included thousands of titles that Catholics were forbidden to read. This wasn't just a list of books that happened to conflict with church teaching. It was a catalog of dangerous ideas that needed to be kept from public view. Many of the books on this list have never been republished. Their contents remain known only to church authorities and the few scholars granted special access to Vatican collections. What ideas were so threatening that they couldn't be allowed into general circulation? What knowledge was so dangerous that ordinary people couldn't be trusted with it?
The answer may lie in the Church's approach to ancient maps and geographical knowledge. Hidden within Vatican collections are cartographic treasures that shouldn't exist according to official history. Maps showing coastlines that weren't supposed to be discovered for centuries. Charts depicting Antarctica free of ice, suggesting knowledge of that continent's geography before the Ice Age. Navigational documents that reveal extensive ancient contact between civilizations that officially never met. The most famous example is the source material used by Admiral Piri Reis for his 1513 world map. Piri Reis himself stated that his map was compiled from much older charts, some dating back centuries. These source maps displayed knowledge of the Americas that Europeans weren't supposed to possess until after Columbus. Where are those original source maps now? The trail leads, once again, to Vatican archives. The Church's control over geographical knowledge wasn't accidental. Maps represent power, the power to navigate, explore, trade, and conquer. An institution that controlled map-making, controlled humanity's understanding of the world itself. And if that institution possessed maps showing lands and routes that weren't supposed to be known, they held the ultimate strategic advantage. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Vatican's hidden empire isn't what they've collected, but what they've done with it. For over a millennium, the Church has operated as humanity's unofficial curator, deciding which ideas deserve preservation and which should be forgotten. They've determined which version of history gets taught in schools, which scientific theories receive support, and which philosophical concepts are deemed acceptable for public consumption. This isn't preservation, it's censorship on a civilizational scale. And it continues today. Despite claims of increased openness, the vast majority of Vatican archives remain sealed. Researchers who are granted limited access report finding documents that contradict established historical narratives, but they're forbidden from reproducing or widely sharing their discoveries. The Vatican's hidden empire isn't built on territory or armies. It's built on secrets. And as long as those secrets remain locked in underground chambers, we can never fully understand who we are, where we came from, or what we're truly capable of achieving. In the silence of those corridors, surrounded by the weight of hidden centuries, lies the answer to humanity's greatest mystery. What really happened during the Dark Ages? And why does someone still want us never to know?
Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the year 800 CE, as it's been painted in countless history books and films. Gray skies hang perpetually over muddy villages. Peasants huddle in hovels, their faces marked by ignorance and superstition. Priests wander among them, the only literate souls in a world that had forgotten how to read. Science is dead. Art is crude. Philosophy has withered into simple faith. This is the Dark Ages, a time when humanity supposedly forgot how to progress. But what if this entire image is a lie? What if the darkness wasn't real, but manufactured? What if the very concept of the Dark Ages was created centuries later by people who needed the past to appear primitive so their own age could seem enlightened? The term Dark Ages wasn't coined by people living through that period. In fact, most medieval Europeans would have been puzzled by the description. They saw themselves as inheritors of Roman greatness, keepers of ancient wisdom, builders of magnificent cathedrals that still inspire awe today. The idea that they were living in darkness came much later, specifically during the 19th century, when European intellectuals needed to justify their own sense of superiority. Think about the narrative structure this creates. Ancient Golden Age, followed by Dark Collapse, followed by Renaissance rebirth, followed by Modern Enlightenment. It's a perfect story of fall and redemption, darkness and light, ignorance and knowledge. But perfect stories should make us suspicious, especially when they serve the interests of those telling them. During the supposed Dark Ages, while Europe was allegedly stumbling in ignorance, other civilizations were experiencing golden ages of unprecedented achievement. In China, the Tang dynasty was flourishing, printing was invented, poetry reached new heights, and technological innovations transformed daily life. The Islamic world was preserving and expanding Greek knowledge, developing algebra, establishing the first universities, and making revolutionary advances in medicine and astronomy. Yet we're expected to believe that Europe, inheritor of Greek philosophy and engineering, simply forgot how to think. But evidence suggests a very different reality. Hidden beneath layers of official history are traces of remarkable achievements that don't fit the narrative of medieval darkness. Archaeological discoveries keep revealing technologies, structures, and artifacts that demonstrate sophisticated knowledge during periods when such knowledge supposedly didn't exist. Consider the Gothic cathedrals. These aren't the crude constructions of ignorant peasants. They're marvels of engineering that required advanced understanding of mathematics, physics, and materials science. The flying buttresses, pointed arches, and soaring vaults represent innovations that shouldn't have been possible without the kind of scientific knowledge that supposedly vanished with Rome. Yet when historians encounter these achievements, they are attributed to divine inspiration rather than human genius. The builders become anonymous craftsmen guided by God rather than brilliant engineers working with sophisticated knowledge. The technology becomes miracle rather than science.
This pattern repeats throughout medieval history. Whenever archaeologists uncover evidence of advanced knowledge or technology, it's either dismissed as an anomaly, reattributed to later periods, or explained away through supernatural intervention. The narrative of darkness must be preserved, even when physical evidence contradicts it. But why would anyone want to maintain the illusion of medieval ignorance? The answer lies in the power structure that emerged from the supposed Dark Ages. The Catholic Church didn't just survive the fall of Rome, it inherited Rome's authority and expanded it into realms the Caesars never dreamed of controlling. While emperors commanded bodies, the Church commanded souls. While armies conquered territories, the Church conquered minds. This spiritual empire required a specific historical narrative to justify its existence. The Church positioned itself as the sole bearer of light in a world of darkness, the only institution capable of preserving knowledge in an age of ignorance, the singular source of truth in a time of confusion. If people believed they were living through an age of darkness, they wouldn't question the authority of the institution that claimed to provide light. If they thought their ancestors had been lost to superstition and ignorance, they wouldn't seek alternative sources of wisdom. If they believed knowledge was fragile and easily lost, they wouldn't challenge those who claimed to be its guardians. The genius of this strategy was its subtlety. The Church didn't need to actively suppress all learning. They only needed to control the narrative about learning. They didn't need to destroy all knowledge. They only needed to position themselves as its sole legitimate interpreters. This is why education during the medieval period followed such a specific pattern. Monastery schools taught reading and writing, but only for copying religious texts. Universities were established, but their curricula were strictly controlled by church authorities. Scholarship was encouraged, but only within narrow theological boundaries. Students learned to read, but only approved texts. They learned to think, but only approved ways. They learned to question, but only approved subjects. This created generations of educated people who possessed technical literacy but lacked intellectual independence. The effects of this education control system extended far beyond the medieval period. When Renaissance thinkers began rediscovering ancient texts, they genuinely believed they were encountering lost knowledge for the first time. They didn't realize that many of these texts had been preserved all along in church archives, carefully controlled and selectively released when the time was right.
The Renaissance wasn't a spontaneous rebirth of learning. It was a carefully managed revelation of knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. The Church positioned itself as the facilitator of this rediscovery, taking credit for preserving the very texts they had suppressed. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this manufactured darkness was how it shaped people's expectations about progress itself. If you believe humanity can slip backward into ignorance for 1,000 years, you accept that progress is fragile and reversible. If you think knowledge can simply vanish from the world, you're grateful to institutions that claim to preserve it. This psychological conditioning created a culture of intellectual dependency that persists today. We still turn to established authorities to tell us what happened in the past, what's true in the present, and what's possible in the future. We still accept that some knowledge is too dangerous or complex for ordinary people to understand. The Dark Ages weren't just a period of history. They were a template for controlling human consciousness. By creating the image of a time when learning stopped, the Church established the principle that learning is a privilege granted by authority, rather than a natural human capacity. And so, the greatest cover-up in history wasn't the hiding of specific facts or events. It was the manufacture of an entire conceptual framework that made people forget they had the right and the ability to think for themselves. In the quiet darkness of medieval nights, while official history claims ignorance reigns supreme,
brilliant minds continued to work, discover, and create. Their achievements were absorbed into institutional archives, their names erased from memory, their innovations attributed to divine intervention rather than human genius. The darkness was real, but it wasn't natural. It was painted over a vibrant landscape of human achievement, creating shadows where light should have been, silence where voices should have spoken, emptiness where knowledge should have flourished. And in those manufactured shadows, an empire of control took root that extends its influence into our world today.
In the hushed reading rooms of universities around the world, there are researchers who have stumbled upon something that doesn't belong. A medieval manuscript with astronomical calculations too precise for its time. An archaeological artifact that suggests advanced metallurgy centuries before it was supposedly invented. A document fragment that references technologies that shouldn't have existed. These researchers faced a choice: publish their findings and risk their careers, or remain silent and preserve their place in the academic world. Most choose silence, but some have spoken out, and their stories reveal the ongoing machinery of suppression that protects the official narrative of history. Dr. Anatoly Fomenko was once a respected mathematician at Moscow State University, renowned for his work in topology and differential geometry. Then he turned his analytical skills toward chronology, using statistical methods to examine the dating of historical events. His conclusions were shocking. He claimed that conventional chronology was fundamentally flawed, with centuries of fabricated history inserted into the timeline. Fomenko's academic reputation was systematically destroyed. His funding was cut. His papers were rejected by mainstream journals. Colleagues distanced themselves from his work. He was branded a pseudo-historian, and his theories dismissed without serious examination. Yet Fomenko's mathematical analysis revealed patterns in historical data that traditional historians couldn't explain away. This pattern repeats across disciplines and decades. Archaeologists who uncover anomalous artifacts find their site access revoked. Historians who question established timelines lose tenure-track positions. Linguists who trace connections between ancient languages face professional ostracism. Take the case of Dr. Gunnar Heinsohn, a German chronologist who spent decades researching discrepancies in archaeological stratigraphy. He documented instances where the physical layers of ancient sites didn't match the timeline attributed to them by historians. Instead of investigation, his work was met with silence from mainstream archaeology. Academic conferences refused his papers. Publishers declined his manuscripts. The message is clear: some questions are not meant to be asked. But who enforces this silence? It's not a single organization or conspiracy. It's something far more subtle and pervasive. It's a system of academic incentives that rewards conformity and punishes deviation. Tenure committees that value sound scholarship over groundbreaking discoveries. Peer review processes that filter out challenging ideas. Funding bodies that support safe research over revolutionary inquiry. Behind this system, however, lies a deeper influence, one that traces back to the same institution that created the original narrative. The Catholic Church may no longer directly control universities, but its influence on academic culture remains profound. Many of the world's oldest and most prestigious institutions of higher learning began as church schools. Their traditions, their hierarchies, their very concepts of authority and orthodoxy are rooted in medieval ecclesiastical culture.
This isn't conspiracy. It's cultural momentum. Ideas shape institutions, and institutions shape ideas. When an organization spends centuries controlling the flow of knowledge, that control becomes embedded in the very structure of how knowledge is pursued and validated. Consider what happens to researchers who venture too close to forbidden territory. They don't disappear mysteriously or face dramatic persecution. Instead, they encounter a wall of professional indifference. Their work is ignored rather than refuted. Their findings are dismissed as interesting but irrelevant rather than seriously examined. This soft censorship is far more effective than dramatic suppression. When someone is publicly attacked or persecuted, it draws attention to their ideas. But when someone is simply ignored, their work vanishes into academic obscurity without creating martyrs or generating curiosity. The few researchers who persist despite this institutional pressure often find refuge in the margins, independent institutes, private funding, self-publication. But marginalization comes with a price. Their work is automatically suspect because it exists outside established channels. The system protects itself by creating a circular logic where challenging ideas are excluded because they're not mainstream, and they're not mainstream because they've been excluded. Yet some voices refuse to be silenced entirely. Throughout history, secret societies and esoteric traditions have preserved alternative perspectives on human history and knowledge. These groups, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, various Hermetic orders, maintained parallel traditions of learning that existed alongside but separate from official academic channels. These societies understood something crucial. When institutional orthodoxy becomes too rigid, knowledge must find underground pathways to survive. They develop symbolic languages, initiation systems, and oral traditions that could preserve dangerous ideas across generations without direct confrontation with authority. The symbols carved into medieval cathedrals, the geometric principles embedded in ancient architecture, the allegorical texts of alchemical traditions, these weren't just artistic expressions or religious metaphors. They were libraries encoded in stone and symbol, preserving knowledge that couldn't safely exist in written form. Modern researchers who understand these symbolic languages sometimes uncover remarkable continuities. Mathematical principles that supposedly weren't discovered until the Renaissance were actually encoded in cathedral architecture centuries earlier. Scientific concepts that officially emerged during the Enlightenment can be found hidden in alchemical texts from the medieval period. But publishing such discoveries requires navigating the same institutional barriers that have protected orthodox narratives for centuries. Academic journals won't accept papers that rely on occult sources. University presses won't publish books that challenge fundamental historical assumptions. The very vocabulary needed to discuss these alternative traditions, words like hermetic, esoteric, or initiatory, trigger immediate academic skepticism.
This creates a profound irony. The knowledge that secret societies worked to preserve remains secret, not because they guarded jealously, but because mainstream academia refuses to take it seriously. Meanwhile, individual researchers continue to stumble upon anomalies that don't fit official timelines, carbon dating results that place artifacts centuries earlier than expected, linguistic analysis that reveals unexpected connections between ancient cultures, astronomical calculations that suggest sophisticated mathematical knowledge in supposedly primitive societies. Each discovery represents a choice point: conform to established narratives or risk professional suicide. Most researchers choose conformity, filing away their troubling findings or reinterpreting them to fit acceptable frameworks. The few who persist in asking dangerous questions find themselves increasingly isolated from their colleagues and institutions. But isolation breeds perspective. Removed from the pressure to conform, marginalized researchers often develop insights that would be impossible within orthodox academic culture. They begin to see patterns that institutional thinking obscures. They recognize connections that departmental boundaries prevent others from noticing. These silenced voices represent humanity's memory trying to reassert itself. Despite centuries of narrative control, despite institutional pressure, despite professional consequences, the truth continues to surface in fragments and whispers. In coffee shops near university campuses, retired professors share theories they never dared publish. In private correspondence, archaeologists discuss findings they couldn't include in official reports. In the margins of academic conferences, researchers whisper about discoveries that don't fit the timeline. The conversation continues, pushed underground, but never fully silenced. And perhaps that's exactly where revolutionary ideas need to incubate, away from the sterilizing influence of institutional orthodoxy, in the spaces where curiosity can flourish without constraint. Because the greatest cover-up in history isn't just about hiding the past. It's about controlling the future by determining which questions we're allowed to ask, which evidence we're permitted to examine, and which conclusions we're authorized to reach. The silenced voices aren't crying out about ancient mysteries. They're warning us about present dangers. The danger of intellectual conformity, the risk of institutional capture, and the gradual erosion of humanity's most precious capacity, the ability to think freely about our own existence.
Sometimes the most profound secrets are hidden, not in locked vaults or forbidden archives, but in the everyday world around us. They exist in structures we pass daily, in symbols carved into public buildings, in artworks hanging in museums, in the very names of our cities and streets. The evidence of the greatest cover-up in history isn't buried deep underground. It's scattered across the landscape of our civilization, waiting for eyes that know how to see. Walk through any European city built during the medieval period, and you'll encounter architectural mysteries that don't fit the narrative of the Dark Ages. Gothic cathedrals soar toward heaven with mathematical precision that supposedly wouldn't be understood for centuries. Flying buttresses distribute weight according to principles of physics that weren't officially discovered until the Renaissance. Rose windows display geometric relationships that suggest knowledge of advanced mathematics. Consider Notre Dame de Paris, begun in 1163 during the supposed height of medieval ignorance. Its architects somehow understood complex structural engineering, advanced acoustics, and sophisticated masonry techniques. They incorporated astronomical alignments, mathematical ratios, and symbolic geometries that reveal deep knowledge of ancient wisdom traditions. But here's what's truly mysterious. When you examine the construction records of these cathedrals, the architects remain largely anonymous. We know the names of bishops and abbots who commissioned the work, but the actual designers, the brilliant minds who conceived these mathematical marvels, have been erased from history. This pattern of anonymous genius repeats across medieval Europe. Magnificent structures appear with no recorded architects. Revolutionary innovations emerge with no documented inventors. Artistic masterpieces are created by unknown hands. It's as if an entire class of people, the engineers, mathematicians, and designers who drove human progress, simply chose to remain invisible. Or perhaps
they were made invisible. Embedded within these structures are symbols that tell a different story than the official narrative. Celtic knots interweave with Christian crosses. Ancient astronomical symbols appear alongside biblical imagery. Geometric patterns that wouldn't look out of place in Islamic architecture decorate the walls of Christian churches. These aren't accidental decorations. They're a sophisticated symbolic language that preserved forbidden knowledge in plain sight. When books could be burned and scholars silenced, stone spoke in whispers that lasted centuries. Take the mysterious figures carved into cathedral facades across Europe. Among the saints and biblical characters, you'll find images that clearly don't belong to Christian tradition. Green men with vegetation growing from their faces, symbols of ancient nature religions that supposedly vanished with the rise of Christianity. Astronomical figures holding instruments that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Craftsmen displaying tools and techniques that suggest technological knowledge far beyond their supposed era.
Even more telling are the mathematical relationships built into these structures. The golden ratio appears repeatedly in cathedral proportions. Sacred geometry that traces back to ancient Egyptian and Greek traditions forms the basis of their design. Acoustic properties that require sophisticated understanding of wave physics enhance the musical experience within these spaces. These weren't coincidences or lucky guesses. They were the products of minds that understood principles modern science attributes to much later periods. But perhaps the most revealing evidence lies in the maps and navigational knowledge that somehow survived the supposed Dark Ages. Hidden in monastic libraries and noble archives across Europe are charts and geographical documents that show knowledge of the world that shouldn't have existed. Maps depicting the coastlines of the Americas centuries before Columbus. Charts showing Antarctica as it would appear without ice sheets. Navigation routes across oceans that Europeans supposedly couldn't cross. These documents don't fit the timeline we've been taught, yet they exist in archives that can be traced to medieval origins. The famous Vinland map, though controversial, suggests Norse knowledge of North American geography in the 11th century. The Cantino planisphere of 1502 shows such accurate depictions of recently discovered coastlines that it implies access to much older source materials. The Frau Mauro map of 1459 displays geographical knowledge that exceeds what 15th century exploration should have provided. Where did this knowledge come from? The official explanation is that these maps were based on accumulated sailor accounts and careful observations. But the level of accuracy they display suggests systematic exploration and mapping that would have required organized expeditions far beyond the capabilities officially attributed to medieval Europe. Perhaps most intriguingly, linguistic analysis reveals hidden connections between cultures that supposedly had no contact during the Dark Ages. Words, concepts, and technical terms appear across languages in patterns that suggest extensive cultural exchange during periods when such exchange wasn't supposed to be possible. Medical terminology appears in Germanic languages that can only have come from Arabic sources. Astronomical concepts show up in Celtic traditions that mirror Asian systems. Engineering terms spread across European languages in ways that suggest shared technological knowledge. These linguistic traces tell stories of contact, communication, and cultural exchange that the official narrative claims didn't happen. They suggest a medieval world far more connected and sophisticated than the isolated, ignorant Europe described in history books.
Even more revealing are the artistic techniques that appear suddenly in medieval European art without apparent precedent.
Perspective drawing, that supposedly wasn't developed until the Renaissance, appears in manuscript illuminations from centuries earlier. Realistic human anatomy shows up in sculptures created by artists who allegedly had no access to dissection or anatomical study. Oil painting techniques that are officially attributed to Flemish masters of the 15th century can be found in works from the 12th century. Optical principles that weren't supposed to be understood until the scientific revolution were clearly being applied by medieval artists. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're evidence of systematic knowledge that somehow existed during periods when such knowledge was supposedly impossible. Perhaps most telling is what happens when modern researchers try to investigate these anomalies. Art historians explain away advanced techniques as lucky accidents or primitive approximations. Archaeologists reclassify artifacts that don't fit established timelines. Linguists dismiss unexpected language connections as contamination from later periods. The evidence is systematically reinterpreted, reclassified, or ignored to maintain narrative consistency. When physical reality contradicts official history, it's reality that gets questioned. But stone doesn't lie. Mathematics doesn't conform to political narratives. Linguistic patterns follow their own laws regardless of historical convenience. The evidence of a more sophisticated medieval world continues to accumulate, hidden in plain sight, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. In the shadows of cathedrals, in the precision of anonymous architects, in the whispers of symbolic languages carved in stone, a different story emerges. Not the story of a dark age filled with ignorance and superstition, but the story of brilliant minds working in secret, preserving knowledge in forms that could survive centuries of suppression. The greatest cover-up in history wasn't just about hiding documents in archives. It was about making us forget how to read the evidence that surrounds us every day. It was about training us to see primitive craftsmanship where mathematical genius exists, to see religious symbolism where ancient wisdom persists, to see historical coincidence where systematic knowledge preservation continues. The truth isn't locked away in Vatican vaults. It's built into the very foundations of our civilization, waiting patiently for humanity to remember how to see what has always been there. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that everything you thought you knew about human progress was wrong. That our species hadn't slowly crawled out of primitive darkness, but had been deliberately held back from reaching our true potential. That the timeline of civilization itself had been manipulated to serve the interests of those who benefited from humanity's artificial ignorance. This isn't science fiction. This is the logical conclusion of the evidence we've been exploring together tonight. If the Dark Ages represent the greatest cover-up in history, if centuries of human achievement were systematically hidden, if our timeline was manipulated, if knowledge was deliberately suppressed, then we must confront a disturbing question. How much faster could human civilization have progressed without this manufactured delay? Consider the implications. If medieval Europe possessed advanced knowledge that was hidden rather than lost, if the Renaissance was simply the controlled release of previously suppressed information, if scientific breakthroughs were delayed by centuries to maintain institutional power, then humanity may be living thousands of years behind our natural developmental curve. The technologies we consider cutting edge today, our understanding of astronomy, mathematics, engineering, medicine, might have been achieved centuries or even millennia ago if knowledge had been allowed to flow freely rather than being locked away in institutional archives. Think about what this means for our understanding of human potential. We've been taught that progress is slow, fragile, and easily reversed, that civilizations naturally rise and fall in cycles, that knowledge can simply vanish from the world, requiring rediscovery by later generations. But what if none of this is true? What if the only thing holding back human progress has been the systematic suppression of human curiosity and innovation? This possibility transforms our perspective on current global challenges. Problems we consider intractable, disease, poverty, environmental degradation, conflict, might have solutions that already exist in suppressed archives or forgotten traditions. Medical knowledge that could save millions might be gathering dust in locked vaults. Energy technologies that could end scarcity might be hidden in coded alchemical texts. Social systems that could reduce conflict might be documented in forbidden political treatises. But the implications extend beyond technology and science, into the realm of human consciousness itself. The control of historical narrative isn't just about hiding facts. It's about shaping how we understand ourselves as a species. If you believe humanity naturally tends toward ignorance and superstition, you'll accept the need for institutions that claim to guide and protect you. If you think knowledge is fragile and easily lost, you'll be grateful to authorities who promise to preserve it. If you assume progress is inherently slow and difficult, you'll be patient with systems that deliver change incrementally rather than demanding rapid transformation. These beliefs aren't just opinions. They're the psychological foundation of institutional power. When people believe they're naturally ignorant, they don't question authority. When they think knowledge is too complex for ordinary understanding, they defer to experts. When they assume progress is inherently gradual, they don't demand immediate solutions to urgent problems.
The Dark Ages narrative serves all of these psychological control functions. It teaches us that human civilization is fragile, that knowledge can disappear, that institutions are necessary to prevent regression into barbarism. It makes us grateful for gradual progress rather than demanding rapid advancement. But what would happen if humanity truly understood our suppressed capabilities? If we realized that the barriers to progress aren't natural limitations, but artificial constraints? If we discovered that the only thing preventing us from solving our greatest challenges is the systematic withholding of solutions that already exist? This possibility becomes even more profound when we consider the global nature of knowledge suppression. The Catholic Church wasn't the only institution that controlled information during the medieval period. Similar patterns of knowledge concentration and suppression appeared in Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, and Confucian societies. Different institutions, different methods, but the same basic strategy. Collect knowledge, control access, maintain power through information asymmetry. What if this represents a planetary pattern rather than isolated incidents? What if there's been a systematic effort across cultures and centuries to keep humanity operating below our true potential? Consider the consistency of certain forbidden topics across different civilizations. Ancient technologies, alternative energy sources, consciousness expanding practices, historical connections between supposedly isolated cultures, advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge. These subjects appear as sensitive or suppressed across remarkably diverse societies. This suggests that the knowledge being hidden
isn't just culturally specific information, but universal principles that could fundamentally transform human civilization. Principles so powerful that every major institution, regardless of its religious or political orientation, has felt compelled to control access to them. But perhaps the most significant implication involves our relationship with time itself. If the timeline of human history has been manipulated, if centuries were artificially inserted or removed, if the pace of progress was deliberately slowed, then our understanding of cause and effect in human development is fundamentally flawed. We make decisions about our future based on assumptions about our past. We predict how long technological development will take based on historical precedents. We estimate how quickly social change can occur based on previous examples. But if that historical data is corrupted, our predictions and plans become unreliable.
This uncertainty extends to our understanding of cycles and patterns in human affairs, the rise and fall of civilizations, the periodicity of technological revolutions, the timing of social transformations. All of these might be artifacts of manipulated timelines rather than natural historical rhythms. What would authentic human development look like without institutional interference? How quickly could we solve current global challenges if we had access to suppressed knowledge? How rapidly could consciousness evolve if we weren't constrained by artificially imposed limitations? These questions can't be answered definitively, but the evidence suggests the possibilities are far greater than we've been led to believe. Archaeological anomalies hint at past achievements that exceed current capabilities. Encoded knowledge and ancient traditions point toward technologies we're only beginning to rediscover. Suppressed scientific research suggests breakthroughs that could transform civilization within decades rather than centuries. The greatest cover-up in history isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about maintaining systems that benefit from humanity's artificial limitations. It's about preserving power structures that depend on scarcity, ignorance, and gradual change. But every cover-up contains the seeds of its own revelation. The very effort required to maintain false narratives eventually becomes unsustainable. The energy needed to suppress knowledge eventually exceeds the energy needed to reveal it. The institutions that benefit from the cover-up eventually become vulnerable to the truths they've tried to hide. We may be approaching such a moment now. Digital technologies make information harder to control. Global communication makes suppression more difficult. Independent research bypasses traditional gatekeepers. The boundaries that once protected institutional monopolies on knowledge are becoming increasingly porous. Perhaps the greatest cover-up in history is finally reaching its expiration date, not because those who benefit from it have chosen to reveal the truth, but because the truth is revealing itself despite their efforts to contain it. And when humanity finally understands what we've been capable of all along, the transformation that follows might make the Renaissance look like a minor adjustment in human consciousness.
In university libraries around the world, in the quiet hours after midnight, when most researchers have gone home, a different kind of scholarship is taking place. PhD students pore over ancient texts with translation software that reveals meanings hidden for centuries. Computer programmers analyze historical data with algorithms that expose patterns human eyes might miss. Independent researchers connected by the internet share discoveries that traditional academic channels would never publish. This is the new underground.
Not secret societies meeting in shadowy chambers, but a global network of curious minds armed with tools that previous generations of truth seekers could never have imagined. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a digital archaeologist at MIT, spends her evenings running pattern recognition software on medieval manuscripts. Her algorithms detect anomalies in dating, identify copied passages across different time periods, and reveal hidden connections between supposedly unrelated texts. What she's finding contradicts centuries of established chronology. But she publishes her results on open-access platforms that bypass traditional peer review. In Prague, Professor Jan Novak uses satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to map archaeological sites without ever getting permission from national authorities. His discoveries of advanced engineering in supposedly primitive settlements are shared through YouTube videos that reach millions of viewers, circumventing academic gatekeepers entirely. These modern truth seekers aren't conspiracy theorists or fringe researchers. They're credentialed scholars using cutting-edge technology to re-examine old assumptions. But they've learned that revolutionary discoveries require revolutionary distribution methods. The digital revolution has fundamentally altered the landscape of knowledge control. For the first time in human history, information can be shared instantly across the globe without institutional approval. Massive databases make primary sources accessible to anyone with internet access. Translation software breaks down language barriers that once protected regional secrets. Crowdsourced research projects harness collective intelligence to solve problems that stumped individual scholars for decades. Consider Project Gutenberg, which has digitized over 60,000 historical texts and made them freely available online. Many of these documents were previously accessible only to a handful of specialized researchers. Now anyone can read primary sources that might contradict official historical narratives. Wikipedia, despite its flaws, represents something unprecedented, a collaborative encyclopedia that no single institution controls. While establishment sources criticize its reliability, it often provides access to information and perspectives that traditional encyclopedias would never include. Even more significant are the blockchain-based archives now being developed to create permanent, uncensorable records of historical documents. Once information is distributed across these networks, no authority can remove or alter it. This technology could finally break the ancient monopoly on historical preservation. But the most powerful tool in the modern truth seeker's arsenal is simply the ability to connect with others who share their curiosity. Online forums bring together researchers from different disciplines who might never have encountered each other in traditional academic silos. A linguist in Tokyo can collaborate with an archaeologist in Cairo and a historian in São Paulo on projects that transcend institutional boundaries. These collaborations are revealing connections that compartmentalized academic departments would never discover. Patterns that span continents and centuries become visible when global perspectives combine. Evidence that seemed insignificant in isolation gains meaning when viewed as part of larger datasets. Take the growing movement of citizen archaeologists using satellite imagery to identify previously unknown historical sites. Platforms like Google Earth allow anyone to survey vast territories from their computer. Enthusiasts have discovered everything from Roman settlements to medieval monasteries that official surveys missed. Their findings, shared through social media and online databases, create a parallel archaeological record that exists outside institutional control. Similarly,
Amateur historians armed with genealogy software are tracing family lineages that reveal unexpected connections between historical figures. DNA testing services provide genetic data that sometimes contradicts official historical relationships. These discoveries, while individually small, collectively suggest that our understanding of medieval European social networks may be fundamentally incomplete. The democratization of historical research is producing uncomfortable revelations for established institutions. When thousands of independent researchers examine the same evidence with fresh eyes, inconsistencies in official narratives become impossible to ignore. Dating discrepancies that individual scholars might have dismissed as anomalies become obvious patterns when analyzed by crowdsourced projects. But perhaps the most significant development is the emergence of alternative academic institutions that operate outside traditional funding and approval systems. Online universities, independent research institutes, and crowd-funded scholarly projects are creating parallel educational structures that don't depend on establishment support.
These new institutions can afford to pursue research questions that traditional universities consider too controversial or unproductive. They can publish findings that peer-reviewed journals would reject. They can challenge fundamental assumptions without risking tenure or funding. The result is an accelerating divergence between official academic consensus and emerging alternative perspectives. While mainstream historians continue to defend traditional chronologies, independent researchers are building increasingly sophisticated challenges to established timelines. While traditional archaeologists maintain conservative interpretations of their findings, digital archaeologists are revealing patterns that suggest much more complex historical realities. This divergence creates an interesting dynamic. As alternative research becomes more sophisticated and more widely accessible, traditional institutions face a choice: adapt to new evidence or become increasingly irrelevant to public understanding of history. Some establishment scholars are beginning to acknowledge this pressure. Museums are starting to incorporate digital technologies that allow visitors to explore alternative interpretations of historical events. Universities are experimenting with online platforms that enable collaborative research across institutional boundaries. Even some traditional publishers are creating open-access journals that bypass conventional gatekeeping mechanisms. But resistance remains strong in many quarters. Academic career advancement still depends on conformity to established paradigms. Funding agencies continue to favor safe research over revolutionary inquiry. Professional societies maintain standards that exclude unconventional approaches to historical investigation. This creates a two-tier system of historical knowledge: official narratives maintained by traditional institutions and alternative perspectives developed by independent researchers. The gap between these two tiers is widening as digital tools make independent research more powerful and more accessible. Perhaps most importantly, the new generation of truth seekers isn't waiting for institutional permission to pursue forbidden questions. They're using available technology to investigate historical mysteries, sharing their findings through decentralized networks, and building cumulative bodies of evidence that challenge fundamental assumptions about human history. The ancient monopoly on knowledge is breaking down not through dramatic confrontation, but through technological obsolescence. When anyone can access primary sources, anyone can collaborate with global research networks, and anyone can publish their findings to worldwide audiences, the traditional gatekeepers become irrelevant. This transformation is happening quietly, one discovery at a time, one connection at a time, one mind at a time. The greatest cover-up in history is being unraveled
not by institutional authorities, but by ordinary people armed with extraordinary tools and unlimited curiosity.
As the night deepens around us and our journey through the shadows of history draws to a close, let's pause for a moment to consider what we've discovered together. In the space of these quiet hours, we've explored a possibility so vast and profound that it challenges everything we thought we knew about human civilization. What if the greatest cover-up in history isn't a single dramatic event, but a millennium-long manipulation of human consciousness itself? What if the Dark Ages weren't a period of ignorance and stagnation, but a carefully constructed illusion designed to hide humanity's true capabilities? What if the very timeline we use to understand our past has been edited, manipulated, and rewritten by those who benefited from keeping us ignorant of our own potential? The evidence we've examined tonight points toward a disturbing conclusion: that for over 1,000 years, human progress was artificially constrained by institutions that understood that knowledge is the ultimate source of power. By controlling what people could learn, what they could question, and what they could remember about their own history, these institutions created a world where entire civilizations accepted limitations that were never natural or necessary. Think about the scope of this deception. Not just the hiding of individual documents or the suppression of specific discoveries, but the systematic rewriting of human history to create a narrative of fragility, ignorance, and dependence. The transformation of brilliant engineers into anonymous craftsmen guided by divine inspiration. The conversion of scientific achievements into religious miracles. The replacement of human genius with supernatural intervention. This wasn't just censorship, it was the manufacture of an entirely false understanding of human nature itself. But perhaps the most profound revelation isn't what was hidden, but what this hiding reveals about human potential. If knowledge could be suppressed so completely for so many centuries, if progress could be delayed for generations, if entire civilizations could be convinced to accept artificial limitations, then the inverse must also be true. Human capabilities must be far greater than we've been led to believe. The technologies we struggle to develop today might have been achieved centuries ago if knowledge had flowed freely. The social problems we consider intractable might have solutions gathering dust in locked archives. The spiritual and philosophical questions that still perplex us might have answers preserved in traditions we've been taught to dismiss as primitive superstition. We've been living as a species with amnesia, having forgotten not just our past achievements, but our present capabilities. The greatest cover-up in history isn't just about what happened during the Dark Ages. It's about what we're capable of right now, in this moment, if we could break free from the mental constraints that generations of conditioning have placed upon us. But tonight, something has shifted. In exploring these forbidden questions together, in following evidence wherever it led rather than stopping at comfortable boundaries, in daring to imagine that official narratives might be incomplete or deliberately misleading, we've taken a step toward reclaiming something that was stolen from humanity long ago: the right to think freely about our own existence. This is what those who orchestrated the greatest cover-up in history feared most. Not that people would discover specific hidden facts, but that they would remember their own capacity for discovery. Not that secret documents would be revealed, but that humanity would stop accepting artificial limitations on their curiosity and creativity. The tools exist today to continue this exploration.
digital archives that bypass traditional gatekeepers, global communication networks that connect independent researchers across continents, technologies that make it possible to analyze historical evidence with unprecedented precision and scope. For the first time in centuries, the monopoly on knowledge is breaking down. But tools alone aren't enough. What's needed is the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, to follow evidence that leads away from accepted conclusions, to consider possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about human history and potential. This doesn't require special credentials or institutional permission. It requires only curiosity, persistence, and the courage to think independently about subjects that others have declared beyond questioning. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the implications of what we've explored together. Imagine a world where human knowledge flows freely, where institutional gatekeepers no longer control access to information, where people trust their own capacity to understand complex truths rather than deferring to external authorities. Picture yourself as part of a growing network of truth seekers who refuse to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are available. See yourself contributing to the great work of recovering humanity's lost memory and reclaiming our suppressed potential. The greatest cover-up in history succeeded for centuries because it operated in isolation. When information was scarce, communication was limited, and questioning authority carried severe consequences. But those conditions no longer exist. The barriers that once protected institutional monopolies on truth are crumbling. What emerges from their collapse might be the most significant transformation in human consciousness since the supposed Dark Ages began. Not because external authorities have chosen to reveal hidden knowledge, but because ordinary people have chosen to reclaim their birthright as conscious, curious, capable beings who don't need permission to explore the mysteries of their own existence. The cover-up is ending not through dramatic revelation, but through quiet awakening. One mind at a time, one question at a time, one discovery at a time. Humanity is remembering who we really are and what we're truly capable of achieving. Tonight, you've become part of that awakening. The questions raised in these quiet hours will continue to work in your consciousness, opening pathways of inquiry that lead to new discoveries and deeper understanding. The evidence we've examined together will connect with other evidence you encounter, creating patterns of meaning that no authority can control or contain.
This is how the greatest cover-up in history finally ends. Not with institutional confession or official revelation, but with individual minds refusing to accept artificial boundaries on human knowledge and potential. The truth doesn't need authorities to validate it. It doesn't need institutions to preserve it. It doesn't need permission to exist. It needs only minds willing to recognize it when it appears, and courage willing to follow it wherever it leads. Sweet dreams, fellow truth seeker. Tomorrow, the exploration continues. If this journey has opened your mind to new possibilities, share it with others who might be ready to question what they've been taught to accept without examination. Subscribe not just to support this channel, but to join a growing community of people who refuse to let the greatest cover-up in history continue for another generation. Because the most powerful revolution
isn't fought with weapons or protests. It's fought with questions that pierce through comfortable illusions to reveal uncomfortable truths. And once enough people start asking the right questions, no cover-up, no matter how sophisticated or long-standing, can survive the light of collective inquiry. The Dark Ages are ending, not because institutions have chosen to illuminate them, but because humanity is choosing to kindle its own light.